certainly outer conditions influence the state of our mind. So if we don't have enough to eat, we're not going to have a good state of mind. But at the same time, we can have everything materially that we want. But if our minds are messed up, then that's our experience, and our creations and our actions in the world are going to reflect our inner minds. So lots of people have these utopian ideas about how wonderful the future is, but I honestly think that until we do that inner work, until we help people have conditions where they can do that inner work and do this reflexivity and the growth, personal growth that we were talking about, then we're going to struggle producing something significantly better. But I actually agree with you, Bernard. I think potentially if we stop being so horrible to one another, it wouldn't be a perfect world by no means. But I sometimes think if we could be 10% kinder and 10% more reflexive and 10% broader thinking, then that would make a huge difference.
Well, thanks for joining us today on Connecting with Coincidence. Glad to have you with us. And if you keep watching us and like this, it really helps for the algorithm. If you hit the like button on this and a share button with some other people, and we love getting your comments on what we present. And today, we're beginning yet more to talk about ideas that will continue on this podcast for probably the next year or longer. We're going to be talking about what is consciousness. A difficult problem for sure. A lot of people have tried to do it. What is it? It's sometimes called the hard problem. And we'll talk about, with that, the future of humanity. Because in case you didn't notice, we're on a suicidal trajectory right now. We're kind of getting rid of the species by ourselves. It's kind of called suicide when that happens. And I'm a psychiatrist, and so I react to stuff like that, want to help do something about it. And that's what we will all be trying to do, some of us, on this podcast as we go into the future. We're going to be talking about consciousness with Matt Colborn. And before we get into talking about Matt's ideas about consciousness and the future of humanity, I'll just go through some basic definitions of consciousness, the kind of three different definitions that kind of get mixed up when people use the word, but there's more to it. Sometimes it just can mean simply awake, like if you're unconscious and then you become conscious, you're able to look around and notice things. Second, it could mean the neurological process through which the brain integrates sensation, memory, and meaning into your own awareness. So it's a neurological view of consciousness. Third, it can mean the wider field of knowing itself. And this is where we get into trouble trying to know what we're talking about, the spiritual or cosmic sense that something people call mind, spirit, or source. These three meanings overlap every time the word is spoken. And that sound stretches across different realities, just basic everyday life to like cosmic consciousness. And there's a lot in between. When people use the word consciousness, particularly in the spiritual and cosmic sense, I often don't know what they're talking about. And I'm not sure they do either. It begins to look like a word that is a placeholder for something we intuit is there. And I'm trying to get to what the there is as best as we can. And we'll see what Matt will do with us today, because he's written a book, What Lies Beyond What? That's what you might want to wonder about. You got consciousness right there in the subtitle, and he's got a chapter that reviews very nicely a lot of the views of consciousness. People different definitions, and we'll get to Matt and his discussion as a way of trying to understand ourselves what consciousness is. So let me introduce you to Matt Colborn, who's an author, lecturer, and podcaster with a doctorate in philosophy and biology, doctor of philosophy and biology, and a master of science in cognitive science. Currently teaching consciousness studies. I mean, a lot of people are doing that, but what are they talking about? And that's what I keep wondering about. I've just got this guy with a lantern looking around for somebody to tell me the truth, and maybe we got that here today. He's published work includes the nonfiction book What Lies Beyond, which is what I just showed you in the short collection City in the Dusk. And just as a throwaway, he reached Everett the base camp of Mount Everest. So, yeah, I just threw that into his bio. And if that's not going to change your consciousness, I don't know too many other things that would. So, welcome to Connecting with Coincidence, Matt Colborn.
Well, thank you so much, Bernard. It's great to be here.
So, Matt, chapter 2. Let's do it, Matt. What you've told me is consciousness is multidimensional, includes things like basic awareness, which I've mentioned, subjective experience, otherwise known as in the form of qualia, agency and free will, which is not exactly the way some people think about it, the mystical and transpersonal states, which I kind of mentioned, altered states of consciousness is a form of consciousness. It just talk about an alteration of consciousness, but what is the consciousness that it's an alteration of? The subconscious, which is a whole bunch of things, and the collective unconscious, and I'll call also the collective subconscious is in there. And then you also say the self. So these are a lot of, and you know it by telling me this, there's a
Yeah.
lot of different things here. So help us make some sense out of consciousness, please, Matt.
Okay. Well, I have to be honest. I'm not 100% certain that I can. I can. The reason why I say that is that a couple of things really. So I suppose you could call contemporary consciousness studies really got going, particularly in the 1990s. And that was when the philosopher David Chalmers coined what he called the hard problem, which is essentially the problem of subjective experience. So it's what is like. It's what is it like to be? So a philosopher called Nagel did a paper called "What is it like to be a bat?" And his argument was essentially that we could understand everything about the biology and, say, neuroscience of being a bat and still not understand what it was like to actually be that sort of flying mammal. And I think for me, that's quite a good way of getting a handle on this problem. But what's happened since the 1990s is that consciousness studies has exploded as a field, and along with it, sort of research programs have exploded in multiple directions. So one direction would be neuroscience and brain imaging. So we have an awful lot of correlations of conscious experience now, and that huge pile of data is growing, or mountain of data is growing every day. A different dimension of it, but related, would be the revival of studies of psychedelic drugs like psilocybin and I was going to say LSD, but it tends to be dimethyltryptamine, DMT, things like that that are being most intensively studied for partly medical purposes, but also other kinds of therapeutic purposes too. So that would be another dimension. And on the philosophy side, when I was doing my very mainstream cognitive science in the 90s, materialism was really the only game in town. That's the idea that consciousness can be basically somehow reduced to to brain function, or maybe brain and body information processing, that kind of thing. But there's actually been a revival of we might call perhaps post-materialist, anti-materialist, non-materialist worldviews. So, for example, Bernardo Kastrup, who, as a computer scientist and physicist engineer, worked at CERN, also became a philosopher of mind, and he is pushing an idealist or a mind-only view of consciousness. So, essentially, there's been a huge explosion of interest in the field, a huge explosion in the study, but also a diversification in your basic question, which is, what do we mean by consciousness? And I think you touched on the key point very well, which is that it's an umbrella term, and I think it's acknowledged that it's an umbrella term. So it tends to mean different things in different contexts, and that's actually not that's in some ways okay, because we have other umbrella terms. I mean, for example, reality. What do we mean by reality? So that's kind of a broad, maybe metaphysical term that we perhaps use all the time, but we don't really think about what it means. And I think consciousness is quite similar. So you mentioned that I teach with the Aleph Trusts on their approaches to consciousness course. So, we have to address exactly these issues with students all the time, and definitional issues come up all the time. And I think there are some useful unifying concepts which you can ask me about if you like. But I also think that we have to be aware that it is a multi-dimensional issue that we're talking about here. But if you wanted me to start with a fairly simple definition, it would be subjective experience. What is the nature of subjective experience?
And that is a place that I like to start. What is the nature of subjective experience? Because one of the ideas that I'm finding very important for the future of humanity is the ability to observe ourselves. That we have the capacity to observe our own experience. What we call subjective requires the ability to notice the experience and be able to report it. So when people talk about subjective, they tend to ignore what I call the self-observer, that aspect of the self, of the mind, that can observe the mind's activities. It's implied, it's almost like it's hidden. So part of what I am trying to bring to humanity and to individuals is a recognition of the personal self-observer, that each of us has one of those. Is just to name it, is to identify it. And I know people who observe themselves, but they haven't developed an idea, a construct of what part of their mind is doing that, is observing the subjective, and how that part of their mind is operating.
Yes, so thank you for that. That's a really interesting and important insight, I think. And for a start, it starts to raise difficult questions about the self and what is the nature of the self. So there are traditions like Buddhism, but also some schools of contemporary neuroscience that say, well, the self is an illusion. And then that immediately, for me, raises the question, well, what do you mean by an illusion?
Well, I'm going to slow you down there, because you said thank you, and I appreciate that. Then you went off on the Buddhist thinking, and there's no self. And I'm going to try to keep you on this subjective Chalmers thing,
Yeah.
which you brought up, because I think that the personal self-observer is our piece of consciousness that we have residing in us, and that's what you were beginning to say, I think. And I want to be able to keep you with the subjective experience thing,
Yeah.
because I think that's a good way of describing consciousness in an experiential way. I like that you talked about reality as something we don't know, but if I step in front of a car, I know I'm going to get hit and it's going to hurt. So
Yeah.
that's reality. And I use the same idea with with our personal self-observer. It's something that we can acknowledge is part of our own experience. And I'm saying, and I think you're saying, Matt, that this is an aspect of consciousness. And I'm saying it's an aspect of consciousness which, like stepping in front of the car, is something each of us can experience.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. I mean, well, we could start from very everyday terms that we experience the world. Perhaps you could call us as a center of consciousness, and that our experiences obviously develop and change through our lives through, if you like, the lens of that subjective consciousness. But I think you're alluding to something that's a little bit more perhaps like what we can experience in meditation, where we
Yeah.
take a step back and we start watching, like in Vipassana meditation, where
Yeah.
you're
Yeah.
watching your thoughts come and go and emotions and energies come and go, and you're setting up that sort of observer. And and that's actually probably is where sort of Buddhist or Vedantic ideas and debates start to come in, which is what is the nature of the part of us that can watch our
Yeah.
lives in that dispassionate way.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, yes, thank you. That I mean, I see now where you were going, and that is what I'm being able to just identify here as we talk about consciousness. And you begin with subjective. I'm with you on that one, Matt. And I'm trying to suggest that the Vipassana way of activating the witness, the observer, different terms for it, are not just part of Vipassana, but they're part of daily life of most people, but they do not recognize it. Vipassana names it,
Mm.
saying you have an observer. And I am saying, hey, baby, it's part of what we do regularly. We step back and wonder, what did I say that made that person so upset?
Yes. So I think there are questions here, though. Again, it's like maybe we have multiple aspects to ourself. We have, I mean, I'm thinking really in terms of this of very many wisdom and spiritual traditions here, that we have the idea that there's an everyday self or ego, but that's perhaps the tip of an iceberg of something that's perhaps very much vaster and all encompassing. So I think these sorts of questions start to come in very fast.
I didn't understand that.
Oh well, I'm just trying to think. So what you're saying, if I understand, is that we all have this capacity to sort of self-reflect and look at ourselves even during everyday life. So,
Yes,
for
yes,
example, the example you gave is of someone who, you know, you've had an interaction with someone, and then afterwards you reflect on that
yes,
interaction. So
yes,
that's a very important capacity, and we could understand that on several different levels, couldn't we? So, for example, Douglas Hofstadter, this mathematician, cognitive scientist, talks about the reflexive nature of the self, and he relates it to complex mathematical concepts like strange loops. But if you want to go slightly less technical or more experiential than that, during meditation, I think I keep coming back to meditation because it's a place where we're confronted with that issue.
yes,
If the self is observing itself,
yes,
what does that say about the nature of the self? And you know, I think there's an episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation actually where I think it's Deanna Troy goes, you know, when you ask yourself what to do, who are you asking? So again, we start to wander into those rather strange and paradoxical places that thinking about wisdom traditions and mystical experience actually quite often lead us to. But you're absolutely right. It starts off in with our experience of everyday life. Who is who is the self? So I was on retreat earlier this year, a fairly non-denominational retreat. But one of the questions we were asked is, who is it who's doing the experiencing? Who is it who's doing the seeking?
Yeah,
And it's like, is that like the one hand clapping?
I don't think
Does it
so.
actually have an answer?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think separating the witness, or what I call the self-observer, can allow us to be able to see who's doing what in our own experience. As we can, just as I could observe you telling me about your own experience, our
Mm.
self-observer can do that too. So we can, if we make a separation of a self-observer from the rest of what could be noise or emotions or thoughts or images, then we can begin to define aspects of the self from a more objective perspective.
Yeah, so how may I ask how you define the self and how you see this observer? What's the nature of it?
I don't define the self. I get caught up in Jung's capitalization of the word self, uh, which
Mm.
means the whole thing integrated and the object of individuation, but you never get individuated, as Jung admitted himself, he was not individuated. So there's the big self. The way to understand for me what the self is to be able to recognize our ability to observe our inner experience. Back to Chalmers, back to subjective experience, back to where we just started, is that we can observe our various aspects of what we might call ourselves and put together them in some way. And I'm not here to try to tell you what yourself is or what mine is, but just I don't know if you want to go this far, but one of the aspects of all this that I try to bring up is that we not only have a self-observer, but we also have an observer of our self-observer. We can observe
Yeah.
how, yeah? What does that mean to you when I say that?
Well, it's it reminds me of Douglas Hofstadter's book on the self, which is called I Am a Strange Loop. I mean, he tends to come at it from a very, quite hard science AI kind of materialist perspective, but I think it's a very still a very useful way of looking at the self, that there is this reflexivity going on. So
Yeah,
we're kind of setting up a loop where we're observing ourselves. And once you've set up that loop, you can observe yourself, observing yourself ad infinitum, if you like. But yes, I mean, I think
well,
perhaps it's
let's
a bit,
stay with that.
yeah,
Let's stay with that. You can observe yourself observing yourself. And I don't think we necessarily want to go ad infinitum because it is an infinite regress that you can imagine. The farthest I want to go is to the third one, because if you can observe yourself observing yourself, then you have an observer observing the meta observer who is observing the primary
Mm.
observer. And that's as far as I would like to go, because there's enough to understand about what the function of the personal self observer is to answer your question is what is the
Mm.
self? Because that's a place that we can begin to answer that question. And maybe it's the wrong question. And I think you'll agree with me on that. You've implied
Mm.
that there is no self, uh, is what a lot of people like to come up with. There is no self. I think that's a great idea, but when I'm walking around here relating to people, I got a self and they see it and I see them seeing it. And I have to stay with this reality as well, that I've
Yeah.
got a body. And if I didn't have a body, then I could say I don't have much of a self. But part of the delight and problem of being a spiritual entity having a physical experience here on earth
Mm.
is that we have bodies. That's the whole thing. So
Yeah.
myself is deeply involved with my body.
Oh, 100%. And I think there was a recent, I can't remember the reference, but there was a
That's all
very
right.
recent paper that was talking about how closely perceptions of the self are linked to physical bodily sensations, which seems very plausible to me because I talked to Mark Wittmann, a researcher who uses flotation tanks and researches altered states, and we were talking about how fluid time becomes when you begin to reduce basically in a flotation tank you reduce sensory data, so you're essentially floating in a warm salty puddle of water in the dark, and what happens is that your sense of time self begins to shift
Yes,
and maybe even dissolve in some spaces. So he's interested in experiences of, say, timelessness, and he suggests, and I think it's very plausible, that time and self are intimately linked.
definitely. Definitely.
One of the most fascinating things in his book was he was discussing in disruptions of time in some forms of mental illness like schizophrenia, because he suggested that there's some evidence that what happens in a normally functioning brain is that time gets parceled out in chunks in various ways. And what seems to happen in some forms of schizophrenia is this starts to fall apart somehow.
Yeah.
You'd have to ask him about the details because I can't
Well,
remember them offhand, but I think
we can do another version of that. It's taking psychedelics, or even
yeah.
for some people smoking marijuana. There was old research about time disintegrating with marijuana back this from the 70s. So that time is altered by various brain states, and that's what you're talking about. And so you lose a sense of self, which could be good if you're taking a psychedelic and that's what you expect and want to have happen, or if you're going crazy, that's no fun. But we, us human beings, you, Matt Colborn, me, Bernie Beitman, only you, Matt Colborn, are in that space at this time that you are.
Yes.
Nobody else is where I am right now. This is me right here now. So space time defines our bodies and defines ourself. That is pretty clear. So that question of who am I has to start, I think, space, time, body, now.
Yes, I think that's absolutely crucial. I mean, although I'm already sort of thinking of a lot of these, there are a lot of very dense philosophical arguments about the
Very
nature of the self.
dense.
Is for example, and this is a, again a quite challenging one that I think some research has actually been done on recently, is the person, so for example, I'll give you a concrete example actually. Recently my folks had a very old video from the late 1980s, of me as when I was about 14, 15. And watching that video was a very strange experience because you get a kind of dislocation. You think, how can you forget how much you change over that time and you're experiencing through your own personal point of view. But when you see an external point of view,
Yeah.
it's very peculiar, and it raises all of these difficult questions of what exactly is identity, what persists over a lifetime, and what changes.
That one I'd love to talk with you about, but I want to, I, I'm going to stay away from that one because it's a fruitful form of discussion, the self over time. So what is the self is been debated a lot. We're talking about consciousness, and I was
Mm.
trying to be able to say that each of us has a little bit of consciousness within ourselves someplace. And if we're going to define it, we start with what you're starting with subjective, and I'm saying subjective can't be subjective unless it's reported, unless you tell somebody about it or notice it yourself. And I'm saying that that noticing aspect of the self is where
Mhm.
concretely I can define consciousness.
Yes, absolutely. And that's another dimension of consciousness, which is reportability. And it raises questions such as, is there a, can consciousness happen, however strange this might seem, without awareness? There have been suggestions that might actually happen. And again, I think this is the thing about consciousness. It's extremely fascinating, but you can find yourself going off on all sorts of
They call it rabbit
it's
holes, but I got
terribly
Uh, yeah, they call it rabbit holes, but people forget that that comes from Alice in Wonderland, and
yeah.
Alice had a great time going down that rabbit hole. I mean, she really had a lot of fun. So you got to pick your rabbit holes, is what we got here. All I'm trying to do is stay with. There's Matt Colborn who went to a base camp uh, on Mount Everest, and I'm sitting here too. And I just want to be like regular people talking about consciousness
Yeah.
because we can go off in all directions. But as we talk about it, I think being able to know that you have a self-observer is very important for the future of humanity. To know
I
we
yes.
and you started like you might agree with that. How is that? How does that fit with what you're thinking?
Well, I think, and this is one of the things that I try and touch on, probably not enough in the last chapter of my book, that a lot of our issues actually come from our general state of mind and consciousness. I'm not saying that's the answer to everything. And I think before we started recording, we were beginning to talk about very practical things like the financial system perhaps driving ecological destruction, that sort of thing. So absolutely, those dimensions are really important. You know, economic dimensions are important, cultural, social, political, etc. Those dimensions are very important when we're trying to think about how we might make a pathway to an improved and more benign future for everyone, and I'm hoping for a good chunk of the biosphere. But I increasingly became conscious, and this was partly because of my interest in consciousness and wisdom traditions, was that the inner dimension is quite often neglected or seen as secondary, or it's seen as following from, say, we improve economic conditions for people and then suddenly their consciousness improves. Whereas I don't think that's
No,
false necessarily.
I fully agree
Um,
with the way you're going, is that we have to develop individually, expand our whatever we mean by consciousness, expand that, develop ourselves, as well as develop the problematic financial system and economic system and all those other things. So that that combination that you're trying to describe is vital for the future of humanity. Unfortunately, some people focus on one, the things to be done out there, and don't on themselves, while other people do what I'll call spiritual bypassing and just do it. Oh, I've got to keep evolving. And the funny thing about many spiritual groups is they don't get along with each other in those groups. There's a lot of fighting and
yeah,
jealousy and
yeah,
competitiveness. So fundamentally, we have the external with economics and lack of empathy and capitalism and the drive for more consume, and we have people being spiritual all over the place and not being able to get along with each other. So I am saying that we need to learn interpersonal, not just empathy, and not just with other people, but with Gaia, with our environment, and that the key to that, or one of the keys, is this ability to observe our own experience.
yes. I mean, well, you know, you're a psychiatrist, Bernard. So the importance of insight in mental health. So there is a big difference between people who have significant insight into what's going on for them at a particular moment, and those who don't, in terms of not only maintaining good mental health but also improving it.
Yes,
And I
yes,
think we could perhaps say that this is one of the problems. I mean, one of the things that strikes me about the broader culture is how robotic it's all become, how automatic. And
yes,
I think this is one of the problems with polarization, actually, that
yes,
people have camps, and you cling very hard to very fixed ideas,
yes, you do.
and you don't have you perhaps lose the capacity to step back and
Yes,
to use that reflexive process,
yes,
you know?
yes, 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 yes. Yeah, that's a big part of this. And as we talk about this, Matt, I want to try another idea on you and see how it works for you, because it's still, for me, about consciousness. That I think it's important that we as humanity recognize we are one creature here on Earth. We call it a species. Okay, we're a species, but we have to be able to see that we're all in this together, a term that is often used. But how do we conceptualize that we're all in this together? And
Mm.
my view of it is that we are cells, each of us, in the collective human organism, which we also call humanity. And these cells need to continue individuating and continue to evolve interconnectedness, the interpersonalness. And part of the way to help that happen, I think, is to recognize, as I'm suggesting for the individual, that the collective human organism has a collective self observer or can develop a collective self observer. And it's a form of consciousness, just like your own individual self observer is a form of consciousness. And I'd like to know what you think about that idea of the collective self observer.
Yeah, I think in some ways what we're talking about is a form of maturity, isn't it? It's the
Yes,
developing a capacity to step back and see things from a broader perspective. I think
yes,
that's something we were talking earlier about, maybe touching on what the differences between maybe an everyday sort of state of consciousness and perhaps more expansive states where you are becoming reflexive. And I think for me, a lot of it is about perspective. And one concern that I have is with the sort of intense, you know, really ferocious state of sort of public debate, for example. Um, Often that broader perspective is lost in in favour of sort of factionalism. And what concerns me is is that we're actually losing a capacity rather than gaining it. But let's try and be. I suppose we can try and be a bit more positive than that in and saying that capacity to step back and have a broader perspective, um, develop much more awareness, intuitive awareness, as well as sort of rational awareness
oh
of
yeah,
interconnectedness is crucial, I think. Yeah.
oh yeah, very, very crucial. Your comment about losing the self awareness uh, or losing the function of the self observer is true. As the more people get caught up in rigid thinking, the more they get caught up in rigid thinking. And
Mm.
they begin to not think about what they're thinking about and react. Now, you reflexively, re, the term reflection is a confusing term for me because reflex and reflection look like the same thing, but one is automatic and the other one is thinking about things. So I just have this
Yeah.
so I get caught up in the importance of words. Um, so reflection is commonly used, but I say, where's the mirror when we talk about reflection? Because reflection
Yeah.
implies a mirror of some kind. And reflection itself, when you talk about it, other people talk about it, is really two steps. One is, and you've implied this, one step is noticing a memory, an emotion, an experience, something that just happened with somebody, and then analyzing it. So there's two steps. And that's what people mean by reflection, but they get condensed down into this one thing, which most people understand what it is. But that's just playing around with words and trying to get more defined with them. I think we are losing that capacity of reflection. Some people are, but you aren't. I'm not. You are continuing to evolve. So there's a subset of humanity that is both evolving individually, which you are. You are trying to expand your consciousness. Again, what we mean by that is spreading your awareness wider than just about the narrow thing that you're stuck with and seeing the whole thing so your attention can go to many different things, as well as noticing what's going on around you as well as in you. And I think you are doing both of those things around you and in you and trying to evolve yourself in ways that may be able to help the collective. I think that's in your heart as well as in your mind. And I think there are many other people like you, Matt, who do have the capacity to keep evolving their self-observers.
Absolutely. I'm very glad to hear you say that because I think it's good to know it's good to know that I'm not alone in doing this. But I think this is it. It's actually a very positive message we're trying to bring across. For me, a lot of this is about I this is a belief I have that every individual person has a tremendous
Yes,
potential.
for
You know,
contributing. Yes, that's why I say we're
yes.
all cells in the collective human organism, and each one of us has So, Matt, you are running into somebody who's thinking like you right now. So,
Mhm.
it's very important what you said, that you're glad to know you're not the only one. That touches me deeply, because that's important for you and for me and for the rest of those people who are doing self-development, awareness of what's going on around us, including, you call it the biosphere, I call it nature or Gaia, to notice that we are part of this whole thing here. And we could be having a lot of fun here on Earth if we weren't so nasty to each other, is my basic idea.
Yes. That's such a good way of putting it because I think one of the problems is that when we start talking about the future, again, we bring those, it can be political, but it's also ideological divides with us. And for me, increasingly, what I've been trying to do is put all of that stuff that we get taught in various ways to one side and say, what would a pleasant future look like for me? What kind of world would I like to live in? Forget ideology, forget what affiliation you have. What would be a more pleasant future? And then you start to think about what's actually important. And I think awareness absolutely does filter into that because, for example, I think perhaps I had a very lucky upbringing. I grew up in the country. Much, this was without a lot of the electronic distractions that we have today. Nature wasn't quite as I was going to say screwed up, but you know what I mean. In the sort of 1980s, there was more wildlife about. I mean, there's still a fair amount now where I'm living. So we've got two little deer in the garden, for example. They're sort of, but that's been important to me. And the reason why it's the natural world and that interaction, and it's always felt like a very personal interaction to me. That's important, is I think because of that intense exposure when I was a kid and growing up, and it really it cuts through to your core. And I think this is again a very practical point. I think one problem is that with increasingly urbanized increasingly indoor lifestyles, say kids don't have that exposure, and so that level of awareness drops off.
Right.
But this is multidimensional, so that's one particular important dimension. What I'm trying to say is that I think my values come from those sorts of life experiences
Yeah.
first,
Yeah.
and then all of the particular, I don't know, social, cultural positions that we develop on particular takes on the world develops from that experience.
Yeah. And now toward the in your last chapter,
Yep.
which you said you had to write kind of quickly, um,
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you to describe the world of the future that you envision. And in the time we have remaining, maybe give us some idea, which you already have, about how to get there. You actually are talking about how to get there involves individual development spiritually, but I'm saying psychologically and interpersonally, that tends to get ignored by spiritual groups. I was so amazed to find the spiritual groups fight with each other. The people fight with each other in there.
Yeah.
So what's with that? But now I understand. They're people and they're an organization, and they haven't learned interpersonal connection, interpersonal skills, interpersonal empathy, and a recognition that we're all in this together. And so they just haven't. And they got great spiritual teachers. Baba Ji is one, and Baba Ji's got all kinds of people fighting in his organization for pay attention to me, pay attention to me. No. But
Yeah, well, I mean, the ego can mess things up quite easily, I think. But it's very interesting that before I answer your question on the
please.
future, I think that disconnect you're talking about between sort of specialists, if you like, spiritual groups who are very much into, in a journey, however flawed that is, and are sort of, if you like, our outer culture, which is very disconnected from any kind of inner reflexiveness or inner wisdom at
Yeah.
all.
Yeah.
That 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 needs to be healed for any kind of better future somehow in a non-dogmatic way. So I'm not talking about imposing things on other people, and I think we need to think quite seriously about, for example, what we mean by the secular space in terms of accommodating these inner needs for people, but allowing, not becoming dogmatic ourselves and allowing diversity and belief and all of those things that we should have learnt 300 or 400 years ago. So healing that breach is quite important. But I think, how do I see a benign future? I try and think of what elements would I like to see in the future.
Yeah.
So, for
Yeah.
example, at the outer level, I would like to see this is my ideal utopian future. I'd like to see something like Edward O. Wilson's Half Earth be achieved, which is essentially that we restore the biosphere, we stop a mass extinction, we rewild as much as we can, we basically make the world a lot more pleasant a place to live. We preserve, we support indigenous cultures, particularly in maintaining and growing a lot of the stuff that we've damaged, particularly things like forests. So that's a very practical level. Political, social, organizational. I want to see a world without hunger and want. Obviously, I think that one of my pet dislikes is wasted potential, and my concern is that with all the crises that we have, a lot of people never get to fulfill their potential, even
Yeah.
though they could have it, and they just don't have the opportunity. So however that's done, I'm a bit flexible path with a lot of these things. In terms of governance, a benign government, I'd like to see something like a Hippocratic oath for politics and science. Seriously, I
That's a
mean,
good one. That's a good one. Yeah.
it's utopian, but why not just
No,
like that anyway?
that's good.
But you see, I think, and I think we can look to models. So we can look to fictional models. Yeah, sure. So I use Aldous Huxley's Island as an example, but there are cultures that seem to have got it right occasionally, not with everything. But for example, the Ladakhi people, Little Tibet, sort of 50s and 60s, very benign culture, very low, virtually non-existent murder rate. It wasn't perfect. So I think I wouldn't want to get to, I think things like science and electricity and medicine particularly are really important, fabulous. Let's keep that. So, and where does this all come together? And how I think there's a sort of feedback loop, if you like. So certainly outer conditions influence the state of our mind. So if we don't have enough to eat, we're not going to have a good state of mind. But at the same time, we can have everything materially that we want. But if our minds are messed up, then that's our experience and our creations and our actions in the world are going to reflect our inner minds. So lots of people have these utopian ideas about how wonderful the future is, but I honestly think that until we do that inner work, until we help people have conditions where they can do that inner work and do this reflexivity and the growth, personal growth that we were talking about, then we're going to struggle producing something significantly better. But I actually agree with you, Bernard. I think potentially if we stop being so horrible to one another, it wouldn't be a perfect world by no means. But I sometimes think if we could be 10% kinder and 10%, more reflexive and 10% broader thinking, then that would make a huge difference. So for all it's worth.
Well, that's a start. And I take issue with your, oh, but it's not perfect phrase. And the reason I take issue with that is that the not perfect is a learning experience. When you find out that there's something wrong, then you reflect on it and you examine it. And no better example of that is interpersonally. I have learned that when I have a problem with someone, like I got mad at a friend of mine, pretty mad, in front of a bunch of friends of ours, and oops. So I said, I would like to talk with you about that, and I apologize for being angry there. And we got together, and it was wonderful to be able to tell him. He didn't even remember what happened, what he did, but he was pretty nasty to me. So I got a chance to tell him, and he got to hear it, and we grew a little closer as a result of looking at what was not perfect.
Yes, and that kind of work takes goodwill, it takes a little bit of courage, and it takes a willingness to be maybe vulnerable. So, and I think, an issue that we have maybe on the global as well as on the very personal stage is it can be very difficult to do that. And it does depend on a certain level of sort of emotional maturity, I think, and it's I think it's how do we build communities so that it's all about raising kids in as benign a way as possible. And I say that, and I'm very aware that parents are pretty much invariably trying to do the best for their kids.
Yeah.
But how do we help that? And that's another element I think I touched on a few years ago now in an article I wrote, trying to imagine exactly what you're asking me. How could we make a more benign future? And I think thinking about how we're raising our kids.
Yeah, very, that's
for a start, more nature exposure. I think
definitely, and more play.
More play.
Because that's where they learn interpersonal capacities, by playing. And boys who are stuck on their computers playing video games, while the girls are out there talking about, a lot of stuff. The boys are increasingly losing out on that part of their own evolution. So these are all things that can be addressed, at least listed. And there's a lot of problems. But I think underneath what you were saying about being able to make some of this happen, um, in order for me to have that conversation with this friend of mine, there had to be enough trust. The word
Yeah.
trust is vital in all this. And there's a lot of lack of trust running around here on this planet Earth. And what is trust?
Yes.
Trust, he's not going to hurt me. He's maybe going to be neutral to me. And who knows, maybe he'll help me. There, those are really fundamentals to kids playing on the playground, as well as adults playing on the playground of this reality. So I'm glad you liked that. I'm looking for more fun here. Uh, that play really is fun and learning, and that fun play gives fun and learning because it's fun to learn, and it's learning is fun, and they go together. So that's we're all trying to make a contribution. But what I liked, I guess, most of all in our talking together, Matt, is that I was able to confirm you're not the only one trying to evolve within yourself and with the culture in general. There are more of us out there, and I'm glad that we found each other.
Absolutely. I think this has been an important conversation. Actually, I was chatting to someone over the summer, and we were talking about what you know what you give out, and I think sometimes, particularly in the last few years, I've tended to focus maybe a little bit too much on the negative. I mean, I think the thing is, we need to be realistic about, well, some of the various
Yeah,
dire things that are happening. You just have to look at they've just brought out a state of the world and climate change paper out, for example. So I think it's important to be very aware of the challenges that human beings have. But I
yeah,
think when it comes down to it, um, that shouldn't stop you from imagining how things could change, how you could enable that change. You need to be. I think it needs to be. You need to. You need people need to be empowered, and part of that I think is learning to empower themselves, which
yes,
is why I mean on a personal level, for number of I'm I have personally, I have a dedicated fitness regime. I've meditated for a long time. I do things like yoga. I do other practices. I've have counselors and you know what? I think it takes work, a lot of this stuff,
it does.
and not everyone puts that work in. But I think you need to have a basic faith in yourself that you can develop and change. And I think that's the fundament. Once you have that, you can go forwards and do all the practical things. And there are so many pathways.
That's so true, and it's a wonderful note to end our conversation on, Matt. You got to believe that you've got it, and then if you believe, then you invest. What you do is the exercise and the yoga and the counseling and other things too. You have a bunch of friends, and you're teaching younger people, and that's all part of it. That's a very important source of good energy for you and support for what you're doing. It's not just a one-way street of teaching the kids something. You're learning from them as well. And so you have a lot of belief in yourself and your own capacity to be of service to humanity. And I admire that, and I'm very glad to have been able to learn that about you.
Well, it's hard won. It's hard won after sort of a number of decades of struggle, but also I think, I've had good teachers as well. People I've known, but also that I've read. So I mean, Aldous Huxley, who I mentioned earlier, he talks about working on your sanity, and I think if anyone wants to do anything constructive, you work on your sanity and health, and I think that can be so important in terms of what you give out to other people in community as well as personally.
Definitely. Well, Matt Colborn, thank you very much for being with me today on Connecting with Coincidence. It's been a great education for both of us, and we'll both keep learning. So thank you, Matt.
Absolute pleasure. It's been really great. Thank you.
You're welcome.